Well, welcome everyone. Thanks for making the time on such a beautiful day. We'll let people kind of roll in and get started. We're really excited about this webinar and the associated field tour on Friday. Hopefully the weather continues to be just as nice as it has been this week. Well, again, I want to welcome everyone. This is the fourth of the third year of this Science and Practice webinar series on forest climate change in Maine. We're very excited to partner with the Forest Stewardship Guild and the Maine Tree Foundation. This week, we're very excited to hear from the Appalachian Mountain Club, and we've got a very exciting panel that will join us. If you want to take a minute, you can take a look at the poll that just got launched, and we'll jump right into it once people get a chance to fill that out. While people are filling that out, I just wanted to do our land acknowledgement statement. We respectfully acknowledge that the Wabanaki, the people of the Dawnland, are the original stewards of the forest we're discussing today. University of Maine is located on Marsh Island, the homeland of the Penobscot Nation, where issues of water and territorial rights and encroachment upon sacred sites are ongoing. The university's Center for Research on Sustainable Forests supports forest research and education in the homeland of the Penobscot Nation and other Wabanaki tribal nations. We really strongly support the inclusion of the indigenous science and values in forest stewardship, management, and research. Amanda, do you want to take a shot at the survey that people are filling out in a second?
Sure thing. I think we can probably end the poll in about 5 seconds. Oh, poll is ended. All right, I'm going to share the results. So hopefully you can all see. Almost everybody here is from Maine, but we definitely have about a third of the folks that are from the broader New England region. And I saw a few familiar faces from our past webinars and field tours there in the participant list. So thank you for joining us. What background brings you to this meeting? We have a good quorum of foresters and scientists and other natural resource professionals. We have some folks that identify as interested public or other. So really great hands-on science and practice group here. So any topics that you'd be interested in us covering in a year 4 series, not in a moment, not yet in the moment, but again, just message us in the chat or drop us an email and we will think about that. So I'm going to hit the stop sharing button. And with that, I think we can, thank you, Meg. Please email Meg at crsf@maine.edu with your future topic ideas. Or if you want to host a field tour in the future, we're always looking for great work to show off. So as Aaron said, this is the 4th in the series of FCCI webinars and field tours. And we are so excited today to have the science and practice team from the Appalachian Mountain Club sharing their work in forest climate adaptation. I don't want to take any further time away from them, but I will ask Meg to launch the next poll because this will give our speakers a chance to get a sense of your familiarity, you being the audience, your familiarity with the Appalachian Mountain Club. So please take a moment and fill out this poll. What aspects of AMC work are you familiar with? And you might get to learn something new today. I always do. Have you visited AMC managed forest lands or stayed at their lodges in Maine? I hope we get several yeses there. And if not, you should join us this Friday. And we're also curious to know if you're aware of carbon-friendly forest management. So we'll give folks a moment to complete this poll. And we'll see what we have. So I can see over half of you have completed the poll. We'll give you a little bit more time. Thank you for clicking so fast. 72% have participated and counting. I think we should end the poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Bink, hitting end poll, and please hit share results. So of the folks in the room, many are familiar with forest management in Maine, and even more are familiar with lodges and trips. That's great. A quarter are familiar with climate-friendly forest management that AMC practices, and just over a fifth are familiar with the cold weather and climate research, but others are saying, I don't know anything, tell me more. So this is great. Let's see, have you visited AMC managed forest lands or stayed at their lodges? Some people have done both, and we're always excited when AMC is able to host us, and others haven't, but it's on their to-do list. So are you aware of carbon-friendly forest management? Pretty much everyone is familiar with it, or at least aware of it. And if you're not, you'll hear some great questions and discussion today. I'm going to hit stop sharing. And now I would love to turn it over. Sarah, if you want to start up your PowerPoint, and our speakers, you can introduce yourselves as we get going. For participants, please type your questions in the chat window. We will do our best to address them after the presentations conclude. Thank you very much. And Sarah, are you unmuted yet?
No, so I guess I'll just kick us off and say thanks for inviting us here to speak. There are 4 of us who will each present for a few minutes and give you an overview of our climate change management and research on AMC's Maine Woods Initiative, or MWI. And to start us off, I think Dave Publicover is going to give you an overview of MWI.
All right, Sarah, next slide. Most of you have probably heard of us, but the AMC is the nation's oldest conservation and recreation organization. We've been around since 1876, actually incorporated 3 years before the Sierra Club. Essentially, our mission is to foster the protection, enjoyment, and understanding of the outdoors. And we do that through a combination of sort of getting members and the public involved in recreation. We hope to get them on the path. You start out enjoying the outdoors, you start out, and then you transition to learning about and caring about the outdoors, and eventually you become advocates for the outdoors. Our mission area is essentially from the Mid-Atlantic region, from DC up to Maine. Next slide. So you'll be hearing from myself. Sarah is our director of research after 20 years at University of Maine, so many of you may know her. I've been with the AMC for over 30 years as a senior staff scientist, and I've been involved with our Maine Woods Initiative since the beginning. Steve and Carolyn can introduce themselves. They are basically on the ground management team based out of Greenville. So you will be hearing from all of us. Next slide. So the Maine Woods Initiative began over 20 years ago in the early 2000s, when after we went through a very extensive re-permitting process for our huts and facilities in the White Mountains, our leadership began thinking about opportunities for establishing a new backcountry recreational destination. And MWI was initially a recreational effort. But we had 4 major goals, one of which, again, was recreation. We knew we wanted to establish large ecologic reserves. We wanted to practice sustainable forestry, and we wanted to establish strong community partnerships. Initially, when we got into this, we did not envision ourselves becoming large landowners. We thought we would perhaps be doing this in partnership with a conservation-minded landowner, probably maybe something more in line with the Maine Huts and Trails models. But when the opportunity came to purchase Little Lyford Pond Sporting Camp and the surrounding 37,000 acres of land, and essentially control our own destiny, we jumped on it. And so that was the beginning. But if you had told me back in the year 2000 that by 2023 we would be the owners and managers of 100,000 acres of land in Maine, I would have been as surprised as anybody else, because this was a new venue for us, and a new challenge. Next slide. So again, our land base now consists of 100,000 acres acquired in multiple transactions between 2003 and 2022. Again, within the 100-mile wilderness of Maine, east of Moosehead Lake. The land was acquired, again, from large commercial landowners, primarily International Paper, Plum Creek, and Conservation Forestry. Much of the property has been heavily harvested. Again, it was typical commercial industrial land. I like to say that this is, in some ways, I think it's the most complex conservation project in the country. We have 6 different conservation easements held by the Bureau of Parks and Lands, Nature Conservancy, and the Forest Society of Maine. We've been certified under the Forest Stewardship Council as part of TNC's group certificate since 2015. And we've completed 3 forest carbon offset projects. So we have a lot of people looking over our shoulder and a lot of monitoring going on our property. Next slide. Just a little bit of the conservation context. We are part of a 60-mile long corridor extending from our property up through Baxter State Park and the Katahdin Woods and Waters National Monument, including TNC's Debskin Egg property, the state's Namakanti unit, as well as 2 large surrounding conservation easements. And this makes for a conservation landscape that is almost as large as the White Mountain National Forest, nearly 500,000 acres of fee-owned land and a couple 100,000 acres of easement land. Next. Those of you familiar with the Nature Conservancy's Resilient and Connected Landscapes Initiative, this is their map of estimated resilience in the New England, New York region. And you can see that essentially the 100-mile wilderness Baxter region is one of the largest areas of concentrated and connected above average resilience in New England. And as on the right, you can see AMC's property at the southern end of sort of this high resilient corridor, Baxter at the northern end. Next. So when we acquired this land, again, we acquired some areas that looked like this, very nice, mature forest. Next slide. But there's a lot more that looks like this. Post budworm, spruce fir plantations, young hardwood stands, much of them relatively low quality, much of it had been high graded. So we were faced with a long-term ecological restoration project. Steve is going to be talking about our management approach, but it involves many of the things that are being talked about in terms of climate smart management, exemplary forestry, ecological forestry, whatever name you want to give to it. Next slide. It's a combination of reserves and conservative timber management. We have 4 large reserves that encompass 28% of our land, about 27,000 acres. About half of our land is in active timber management, another 14% in other no harvest protection zones, riparian zones, smaller retention areas, which sort of serve as unofficial mini reserves set aside to protect areas of particularly high ecological or scenic value. And a small amount of, again, wetlands, roads, developed areas. There are also 3 sporting camps that we own and manage, and 1 other sporting camp on our property on an inholding. Extensive trails network for cross-country skiing, hiking, snowshoeing, mountain biking. That's one of the things I think that makes our project unique as compared to what might be done by, say, New England Forestry Foundation or the Nature Conservancy, is the very high level of recreational use and recreational infrastructure on the property. Next slide. Just a look at our 3 forest carbon offset projects. 2 of them are on ecological reserves. Our most recent one, which we just completed in January, is on our managed timberland. 3 different registries. One is under the Climate Action Reserve, a voluntary market project. One is the Silver Lake project, is in the California compliance market. and our current project is under the American Carbon Registry voluntary market, a 40-year project. That is where most carbon projects these days are going, into the American Carbon Registry. So at this point, I'll turn it over to Steve, who is our Vice President of Conservation and Land Management. I believe that's the title. He just recently got a fairly significant promotion. So take it away, Steve.
All right, thank you, Dave. Yeah, next slide, Sarah. Here we go. Yeah, so as Dave so aptly outlined for us, our real challenge has been dealing with a legacy of even age management and trying to figure out, as folks who are thinking more longer term about late successional forest management and how to move stands into a much more dynamic and diverse condition, how do you take conditions like this and transition them over time? And so next slide, Sarah. Thank you. So this is sort of kind of one of our approaches. This is a region, a hillside in T7R9 that we've treated previously, and using a whole variety of different techniques. So we've done some early entry thinnings in some areas. We've done some group selection work. There's some crop tree establishment and some areas of regeneration. And so you can see that a lot of our harvesting visually at the landscape level is focused on preserving and enhancing, where we can, late successional features throughout the matrix, and keeping a diversity of tree heights and age classes on as many acres as possible throughout time. So shifting away from even age management to more uneven age management with a focus on late successional features. And as Sarah goes to the next slide, we'll zoom in on one of the harvest areas so you can see this is that exact same aerial photograph, but now we're sort of right over one of the active land management, the yards actually associated with the road infrastructure. And you can see some of the small gaps that we've created through harvesting, where we've removed throughout the mid-story sort of poorer formed individuals or early successional species to try to adjust density of late successional species and preserve structure throughout the stand. Next slide. Oops, there it is. There we go. So what I thought might be illustrative before handing it off to Carolyn in a second or two is to kind of think about more spatially how we think about retention across the area, and also how we kind of plan harvesting by actually looking at sort of our poorer condition stands first. So this is a map of LiDAR-derived tree heights. And you can see in the legend that the colors indicate height classes of trees, where blue are the taller trees, those trees above 50 feet. And then there's pole size and sapling size timber by different color in those matrices. And it's important to remember that height is not necessarily directly equivalent to late successional characteristics, although it can certainly help you find elements of older forests. So we do a lot of ground truthing to go sort of a little bit deeper with these data sets to try to figure out exactly the areas that we're working in and how our treatments fit within the landscape. So roughly speaking, we tend to stay away from areas that are more blue unless there's a specific region to get in there. And we tend to focus on more of the pole and the sapling size stands for treatments, both commercial and non-commercial, as Carol will talk about in a bit. So next slide.
It's clicked ahead. There might be a little delay, I think, with your connection.
That's okay. Yeah, it must be. Oh, you can see it. Oh, there you go. Sorry. Yeah, the internet here in Greenville is a little slow. Thanks for reminding me, Sarah. But yeah, so on that element, this is pretty typical of those yellow to magenta stands that are pole-sized stands, where there's usually the previous harvest history may have been an overstory removal or some sort of other, maybe perhaps a high grade or some other element that removed quality from the stand. And then here we are 20 or 30 years later. And so our objective is to manage the individual crop trees that remain on the site and continue to grow those along and make space for them to expand canopy and also expand areas around them in some instances through harvesting to promote regeneration of a next cohort, so that we're getting more of a multi-cohort structure across the landscape while preserving quality. So a lot of these mixed wood stands or hardwood stands, we're really focused on removing early successional and poorer quality individuals and trying to leave quality wherever we can. So as you probably can guess, we're generating a lot of pulpwood through a lot of these thinnings. We tend not to cut a lot of saw log material in a lot of these treatments. So next slide.
It's changed.
Okay, perfect, thanks. Yeah, there we go. Yes. So this is another sort of another common technique that we're sort of in a particular phase of right now, is catching up with a lot of post-budworm, even-age softwood stands, some of which were pre-commercially thinned, and we have the benefit of advanced growth on those that we can then go in and pluck out, say, balsam fir, and try to push the stand towards more red spruce to get a little bit longer life out of these even-age stands. But what we're finding is that able to be successful there, we're sort of doing these thinning regimens in sort of two phases, where we're thinning throughout the matrix to push the density more towards red spruce, but also planning in, say, 10 or 15 years to come back to these stands to open them up a little bit more, perhaps with different equipment, to actually focus on regeneration. So these early entries that we've been doing over the first 20 years have primarily been focused on keeping the growth rate steady in these even-age systems and pushing the growth onto late successional species. So next slide.
It's changed.
Perfect, thanks. And so there we go. Yep. All right. So you can see we've had some great results between two big periods of inventory. We had the property inventoried in 2010 and then again in 2020. And you can see the abbreviations down on the bottom of all of these graphs. So KIW is the first property that we purchased in 2003, the Katahdin Ironworks tract. RP is the Roach's Ponds tract, and then they're all averaged in that right-hand column. And what you can see over time is that we've been doing a pretty good job at thinning throughout the diameter distribution and allowing and making space for ingrowth so that we're growing the overall stocking quartz breaker across the property. And we're doing it hopefully in a way that's pushing larger trees across the landscape throughout the matrix. And we're also improving the quality of those trees. One important thing to note, you'll see on the saw timber volume on the KI tract, there's a little bit of a dip there, and that reflects a heavy emphasis on actually thinning through some of the saw log quality stands on the KI tract with an eye towards quality. So trying to promote long-term quality in those stands. So that's sort of where that little dip comes from on the KIW tract between the 2010 and the 2020 inventory. But generally speaking, we're pretty excited about the results that we're seeing so far of 20 years of ownership, where our harvest regimen seems to be making some difference in the overall stocking and quality of the forest. So next slide. Yeah, that one shot right up. Yeah, perfect. So when you look at that at a harvest growth versus harvest on an annual basis, we're harvesting well below growth, and that's very intentional. We're trying to really push the stocking out of, say, the 12 to 14 cords to the acre. We're about 16 cords now to up to about 25 cords to the acre, so much more in line with what you're seeing on BPL's land ownership, Bureau of Parks and Lands here in the state of Maine. And we feel that that'll give us a lot more flexibility to manage these climate resilient features once we get the volume at a level that's appropriate to more sort of in line with biological capacity of these acres to grow trees. And so obviously as growth stays fairly high across these acres, we're thinning to try to promote growth in those even age stands so they don't start to go through stem exclusion, trying to promote space in some of the mixed wood stands and the high graded stands for regeneration and continued ingrowth. That gives us more and more options to down the road use even though our harvests are reduced, still use that harvest component as a restoration tool on the landscape to achieve this higher volume per acre over time. And so with that, a big part of that is what Carolyn has picked up for us as our research forester focusing on early intervention silviculture. So I'll hand it over to Carolyn.
Hi, thanks, Steve. Yes, this will kind of tie in a little bit to what Steve and Dave have already talked about. but focusing more on our early intervention work and work in the pre-commercial softwood and hardwood stands that we have. And we have a lot of that. So one of the slides Steve showed was, or maybe Dave was, we have these young forests. We have a lot of, you know, small diameter stands out there that we see as an opportunity to kind of either allocate more space for growth, or to kind of select species and individuals we think are worth the investment through crop tree release with like hand crew in certain stands to select for quality that we're looking for. And so this LiDAR map on the side here is also similar to what Steve showed. And so those red and green areas, or pink and green, are showing those smaller areas, and a lot of that blue is tied up in ecological reserves or mountains, or kind of represents the more mature areas of the forest on the PRHF. And then, but we still have a lot of these green and pink areas that are showing smaller, shorter cohorts or groups of trees. Yeah, and the graph at the bottom is tied into the same inventory set that Steve was talking about between 2010 and 2020, and kind of just showing how we've already started to shift some of the species composition. But a lot of this, something we recognized was there's not a lot of data that we've collected that captures the species composition and abundance of individuals under like submersible under 5 inches in diameter. So we're suspecting we do have a part of my work is to understand what that looks like out on the forest, and especially in our hardwood stands, the components of each. We know we have good spruce fir stands. We're just trying to get an idea of what sampling what our forest is like under 5 inches in diameter. All right, we can go to the next slide.
Carolyn, I'm sorry to interrupt, but you're a little bit choppy. I don't know if the internet is low, if turning off your camera might help with the audio a little bit.
All right.
Sorry about
Hopefully
that.
this is better. No, I'm in the same office as Steve too, so who knows, the internet's being funky up here. All right, so I'll talk a little bit about PCT, and then I'll talk about our hardwood crop tree release. That's pre-commercial. So we do some traditional PCT that other landowners are doing, and these are 2 different stands that we have already roped off for this upcoming year to have hand crews go in with brush saws and mechanically kind of thin them to roughly 7-foot spacing, or 800 trees per acre, kind of that type of spacing. But we are also doing some thinning, some pre-commercial thinning and softwood stands that might be non-traditional, or other landowners might not see as worth investing in. We're going into some of our like regular shelter woods and thinning underneath. We have one that's got some large overstory white pine, but we've got a lot of spruce and fir growing up underneath. And so looking at in that area, if we can invest the time, the resources now to thin that cohort, and then come back later in time to either remove part of the overstory when we also commercially thin the second cohort later in time. And we're also looking at some stands with taller individuals, and this has been done on some other land ownerships as well. We're seeing what can be done with hand crews if the stands have quality crowns, but they're just a little bit taller than something like in these photos here. So we're working on stuff like that for our PCT as well. So, all right, we can go to the next slide. And so this was our first year doing a hardwood crop tree release in 2022. So this is 2 photos of the same stand. I didn't have super great photos, but you might be able to see that there's blue paint on some of the trees. And this was a stand that we painted our crop trees that we wanted to preserve. And we had a hand crew with small chainsaws go out, and they were actually girdling the trees that were competing with the crown of the crop tree. So we were trying to release them on all sides, and they were girdling the competing trees. And this allowed us to select, we had a good component of yellow birch and sugar maple in the stand. So we were able to select those individuals and remove some of the competing either poor form individuals or competing species that are maybe early successional or intolerant, and kind of removing some of the less desirable species. Our goal here was to mark between 80 to 100 trees per acre and have those released. And then our hope over time is to grow quality crop trees on the stand that might otherwise just take a little bit longer and have other species that might not be as desirable for us later on. So we're trying to grow good sawlog trees on taking the stands that have this good species composition and quality and allocating our resources there. All right, to the next slide. So this is my last slide that'll segue nice into Sarah's presentation. So we do have some partnerships with the University of Maine and some other universities in New England and we're collaborators on a bunch of different research projects that are related to forestry. So right now we've been partnering a lot with Nicole Rogers and Mike Krummer at the University of Maine. And we do have 2 Inspire sites on our property, which are kind of a New England initiative that Sarah will talk about later. We have one commercial thinning site on our property as well. And we are part of John Hegan's 30-year bird research project that was recently re-inventoried. So we're excited about these partnerships and having a whole suite of different research projects on the property. So it's something we're pretty excited about. And so Sarah, I will let you take over.
Sure, and hopefully my internet will work and not be too choppy. I'll start with the camera on and turn it off if we need to. So that was a great segue. Thanks, Carolyn. So I'm going to talk a little bit more broadly about some of the other work that we and partners have been doing at MWI, which is just a fantastic outdoor natural laboratory. It's 100,000 acres of mountains, forests, freshwaters, streams, and there's just so much up there. We've been having a good time in our research department sorting out what types of topics we've started working on and continuing some research that has been going on in other parts of AMC's region, as well as continuing research that others may have been doing at MWI. So I'll talk a bit about water quality and climate monitoring in the Maine Woods Initiative. Here are just some snapshots. I'll give you kind of a brief tour of some of our projects that are ongoing. So first, I should mention a lot of folks know about AMC because, as we saw in the poll, of staying in some of our lodges or hiking trails, participating in maybe outdoor stewardship and volunteering. And a lot of people are surprised to learn that we have a research department, and we do. So I'm the director of research, and AMC has had research, in fact, back to the 1930s when Joe Dodge over in New Hampshire began monitoring climate in the White Mountains. And our research team has been working in more recent decades on topics like air and water quality, climate change, of course, forest ecosystems, as you just heard from Dave and Carolyn and Steve. Mountain environmental research is a big theme for us, given that we're the Appalachian Mountain Club. And we have strong focal areas in cartography and spatial analysis to support all of this. And really the goal of our research team is to provide that credible science that supports our mission as a basis for any of our policy, conservation, and advocacy work. So I'll first jump in and talk about stream connectivity and some of the stream research projects that have been going on across this broad landscape. Steve talked a lot about the forest components of MWI, but he and partners have also led many years of very extensive stream reconnections, largely through culvert to bridge replacements on this just dense network in some places of forest roads. And so stream barriers have been removed in, I think it's over 90 sites at this point, and that number is always going up. So Steve can correct me at the end. And so one question that arose was often stream lengths aren't adequately represented in the national data set of stream lengths, the National Hydrography data set. And, you know, it's a spatial scale of the entire country. So As we know, Maine has really complex topography. These places are remote and we're not always catching the full length of streams. We really need to know the lengths of streams that are going to be reconnected in order to qualify for some of the funding, and really to understand how fish passage will be improved by some of these reconnections. And so again, here's what the NHD data set looks like. In order to figure out, just what length of streams are being reconnected, we started a project a couple of years ago, first with Asha Di Matteo LePape, who was an NRT intern from UMaine's Conservation Science program. And she scoped out by walking with the GPS many of the stream channels, and worked on using LiDAR to develop a better model for delineation and figuring out topographic thresholds for better stream delineations. And we followed up with a project last year where an AMC intern walked even more streams with a GPS on his back. And we have been working over the past year on refining that model and determining some of the other factors that affected how well it could actually predict stream lengths. So that's one piece we've been working on, and really the summary findings from that are that we mapped 14 streams, which is not a fully representative set. There are just so many streams on this 100,000 acres. But we found that NHD didn't even identify a stream in 5 of the sites, and it underestimated stream length for most of the sites that it did identify. So now we are working on refining this model and bringing in factors from the literature and from our observations and GIS analyses that we hope can allow us to better model the stream length that are reconnected across the forest landscape. Another piece that we really launched last year, which was really exciting in collaboration with Andy Rominger at UMaine, is using eDNA or environmental DNA to determine how treatments like large wood additions that, again, Steve is spearheading with partners in some of these streams to recreate sort of a more natural flow path. Using eDNA, which is collecting water samples and sequencing them for DNA, because animals and plants are always shedding cells. So by collecting the water and filtering it through one of these filters, you can determine which organisms have passed through that stream in the past, in the recent past. And so we're using that technique to begin to assess the outcomes of these large wood additions. And we do have funding to continue that again this year, looking at a chrono sequence at different years that have had wood additions, and then looking at how potentially they're recolonized by invertebrates and fish as the streams are affected by those wood additions. I've also worked for a long time, and I think all of my time at UMaine, on lake water quality and trends. And there are over 50 lakes and ponds at MWI, most of which had never been sampled for water quality in terms of sort of their basic measures of productivity, like total phosphorus and how clear they are, which is a really good indicator of overall water quality. And lakes are really crucially important across the landscape. And one of the features about lakes within a forested ecosystem like MWI is that they're connected to the watershed. So we need healthy forests to have healthy waters. And lakes are also connected to the airshed. So they're affected by pollutants coming in from other places like acid rain and mercury, topics I've studied for a long time. And these lakes really integrate signals of change in the terrestrial environment, like our forests, as well as from the air. And we've also proposed in a lot of research that lakes are acting as sentinels, so they respond to environmental changes more quickly than some ecosystem components. And I've used that kind of framework to look at northeast mountain ponds all along the Appalachians and in the Adirondacks, as well as remote ponds like those at MWI. And we've really discovered that the ponds have been responding to acid rain and then recovery from acid rain. But increasingly now, lakes are responding to climate change. And the Northeast and Maine are really experiencing some very strong climate change signals, including extreme events, big rain events, precipitation changes, warming winters, and temperature increases. And we can see the effects of these when we start looking at lake chemistry, for example. And our watersheds in Maine are mostly forested, and in places like mountain ponds, they tend to be mostly softwood, and the heavy forest cover and the conserved landscape around these lakes lets us identify these particular drivers coming from the atmosphere and climate change without being confounded with human development, lots of houses and lots of paved roads around the lakes. So we can really learn a lot in our science from remote and mountain ponds. So we set out a couple of years ago, and I've had 2 interns housed at MWI in the past few years who have spent their summers in a kind of enviable job of, some days enviable, depends on the bugs, of heading out in the woods and first of all, finding where some of these very remote ponds were located, figuring out how to get to them, and getting baseline monitoring going for these lakes. So we've used the Lake Stewards of Maine protocol to sample these lakes for their clarity, as well as total phosphorus, just a measure of the nutrients. And we have so far sampled 26 lakes across the 100,000 acres. We've sampled most of the big ones, and most of the lakes that are left are very small and might be better classed as wetlands. And so we'll be continuing this work, and it really fills a big gap. Maine DEP, Department of Environmental Protection, was a partner on the project, and they've published work looking at reference conditions for lakes in Maine. This geographic area was really a big gap because there hasn't been a lot of work done in the very remote areas in this part of the state. So we're working with them and of course sharing the data to help fill that gap. But what we found so far is that, for example, the concentrations of phosphorus are really aligned with what you would expect for remote lakes. And of course, the forest management and avoiding those riparian areas that Steve highlighted on our map is really key to maintaining water quality. And so finally, a bit about our climate monitoring. So in Maine and really nationwide, there can be really limited spatial coverage for climate monitoring, particularly in mountain areas and also in areas like Maine where the terrain is really complex. It's hard to infer big broad patterns about climate change when we don't have a very fine network of climate sensing. So we've set about trying to fill up this map with additional climate sensors and locations where we're doing research that links climate with pieces like water quality. And so one that Carolyn mentioned is the Inspires network of sensors. These are sensors that can be placed in remote places. They're solar powered, and they're collecting information on air temperature, soil temperature, and snow depth. And these are located in Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont. Erin is the lead investigator for this NSF project, along with UNH and the University of Vermont, as well as Dartmouth. So 2 of the Inspires sensor arrays are located in MWI, kind of in the southern half of the property. There are 3 transects that were used and are continuing to monitor. We're going to take over the monitoring and the downloading of these by the University of Vermont to look at very fine scale climate parameters on the microclimate scale. So these are transects going sort of up in elevation and looking at a phenomena like cold air pooling, just to get a handle on how microclimates are playing out across the landscape. And again, there are transects across the northern New England region. And we're excited to be able to continue this monitoring into the future. And then in order to augment those networks in the northern part of MWI, AMC has placed these hobo microstations that are mirroring those same types of observations, air and soil temperatures, and we have some snow monitoring going on as well. So we're really trying to set up a network across MWI And then in some of my lake and stream work, we've put out temperature sensors so that we can hopefully start linking some of the terrestrial climate monitoring to what's going on in our freshwaters in terms of temperature and potentially ice out if our sensors survive the winter out there. And finally, we have projects including one in iNaturalist that AMC has created, and we use these data in looking at phenological change across the entire Appalachian Trail corridor. So the AT runs right through MWI, and we have citizen scientists and others who are out snapping a photo of spring ephemeral plants like Trillium, Canada Mayflower, blue bead lily, and contributing those photos and observations of phenology, whether they're in flower or in bud, all across this region, with an eye toward figuring out how climate change is playing out in the mountains using that big space for time substitution of south to north along the trail and using the elevational gradients that are present along the AT. So this is a project, if anyone is interested, you can get out and snap pictures in iNaturalist anytime you're out in the woods and contribute those to our science. And finally, community snow observations is another citizen science project where people who are out in the backcountry recreating, walking in the woods, snowshoeing, skiing, can take measurements of snow depth, which is a measurement that we really are missing in many of the mountainous areas of the Northeast, and will play a really critical role in thinking about winter climate change and winter refugia, where the snow sticks around the longest. We really need more distributed data on that. And so with that, we will answer any questions if they've come in the chat, or if folks have other questions to offer.
Bravo. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, everyone. So I'm going to stall. We did have some good questions that came into the chat. I'm going to stall for Meg while our speakers are spotlighted. So I wanted to highlight a few themes while people are typing their questions into the chat. First, I heard that from the surprise beginnings as an industrial scale forest manager, AMC has really been applying its mission and throughout been pairing science and practice, especially under the changing climate over the last 20 years, which is really exciting. So I think there's some great lessons to learn as you're grappling with a lot of the same issues as your neighbors. I was very excited to hear about all the uneven age management work and the ecological forestry goals, personal bias, but and what that is leading to, as your data are showing, is it's leading you toward these desired outcomes in stocking and age class structure. And as the chat thread showed, there are some nuances to what stocking levels will tell you about how you work toward those goals. I'm keeping an eye on the chat if people want to put your questions in there. I also heard really throughout, especially through Sarah's presentation, that scientific data paired with ground truthing really helps AMC to understand these forest ecosystems, looking at lakes and streams, inspires sites, flora, phenology, snow depth. There's a whole lot that really helps you to understand. And by working toward those common goals of healthy forests, healthy waters, healthy airshed, you have a really good pulse on indicators of change. And therefore, what do you do about it? So really, to tie it all together again, climate science informs practice, and it's really exciting to hear about all the great work that you are all doing at AMC. And I'm super excited for Friday's field tour. And I'm surprised that I don't see more questions in the chat right now. Are people being shy? Come on. I know you have questions for our speakers.
While you're waiting, I'll just point out one more research thing, which isn't totally related to climate. But we've had a cooperative forest thinning network site for the CFRU on our property since 2010. And the work that's come out of that network, which shows that you should get in and do commercial thinning in these young even-age spruce fir stands as quickly as you can, has really informed our approach to getting into these stands as quickly as they can. So CFRU research being put into practice. Now we're watching the question of, you're supposed to stop that kind of work, 3 to 5 years before the budworm hits. So we're trying to be psychic and estimate when that might be.
Nice. Thank you for that addition, Dave. And we had a question in the chat from Nancy. She's wondering for Sarah, can you say a little bit more about why it's important to better map or model streams with respect to funding and or other benefits to doing this work?
Yeah, I'm going to kick that question over to Steve in case he wants to talk more about the fish passage work.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, absolutely. No, this this work is really sort of exposed and given more sort of a fine scale level of detail to the gap that we were experiencing anecdotally in the systems. By that I mean sort of there's a lot of NRCS funding and national funding right now focused on sea-run fish to return to traditional spawning habitat and eastern brook trout to return to traditional spawning habitat. And what we're finding and have found over the past 12 years of doing fish restoration work, the NHD data just dramatically underrepresents the really huge biological significance of a lot of these streams that were unmapped. And so a lot of the funding sources have thresholds where projects are only eligible if they open up a half-mile worth of habitat. And so there's a real clear need here to sort of expand this methodology more broadly in this northern, particularly in Maine, but I would argue all throughout the Northeast, because our watersheds tend to be smaller than some other parts of our country, and they tend to be much more sinuous. So they have a lot more diversity of sort of the water courses, change dramatically, particularly in these forested environments from year to year. So this modeling work can help really show the true impact of these stream miles that are just totally discounted right now.
Awesome, thank you for that. Speaking of special places, Jack is asking, maybe I missed it, but what was the criteria that contributed to designating an area as an eco reserve? I don't know if Dave, if you want to take that.
Yeah, since I've sort of had the most to do with that. Initially, when we got the KIW property, we already had a sense from earlier mapping work I'd done with the Northern Forest Alliance back in the 90s about potential reserve areas, that there was something special about the watershed of the west branch of the Pleasant River above Gulf Haggis. The Maine River studies identified it as one of the least developed river corridors in the state. It has special protection under the Maine Rivers Act. And when we acquired the property, we got some input from a retired Maine fisheries biologist who called the essentially the Upper West Branch an ecological treasure trove because it has one of the most natural brook trout populations in the state. Much of the watershed, the ponds have not been stocked or were stocked a long time ago. Gulf Haggis keeps invasive species out. So the watershed of the West Branch above Gulf Haggis formed the basis of some of our larger, our sort of largest contiguous reserve. Others have come about for other reasons. The Silver Lake Reserve came to us as a reserve when it was protected by the Forest Society of Maine. That essentially protects extensive wetlands around Silver Lake and the Pleasant River corridor downstream from there. Baker Mountain reserves preserve the upper slopes of Baker Mountain and essentially some very high carbon forests that were identified by the Nature Conservancy. They helped us protect that area. So it's a bunch of different reasons, but again, the biggest reserve area was watershed based. It's been hammered as heavily as most of the rest of our properties. So that's also unlike the BPL reserves. Our reserves are Silver Lake is in pretty good shape, but the rest of them are to some degree restoration reserves.
So just a quick clarification then. So are ecological reserves harvested or are they not harvested?
No, these are permanently protected by easement. So no harvesting, no motorized motorized use.
Great, thank you.
We are allowed, just say in one of our reserves on Roach Ponds, which is covered by the TNC easement, we are allowed to do some restoration harvesting. There's a lot of young red pine, post budworm spruce plantations. So we're able to get in there and do one round of thinning to try and advance those stands towards a more diverse and natural component. Other than that, they're strictly leave them alone.
Got it, thank you. The next question might be for Sarah. So Carl is saying, I compare this to experimental forests that are sprinkled across our landscape. How accessible is your data and information to private landowners? I envision webinars and field trips like this to benefit the management of private lands that dominate our region. Carl, I hope you're coming on Friday's field tour.
Yeah, that's a good question. In terms of the climate data, we've really just started collecting, but AMC, in general, we're all about collaborating and sharing data. So can't speak for the data that other partners are collecting, but in general, there's sort of the desire to indeed share the information and get the word out about what we're doing and how it could help benefit other folks. And I don't know if there's any comment on the forestry side of data collection as well.
I mean, I'd add to that. I think we love hosting field tours. We love to get that feedback, both from what folks see and out on the ground and can respond to what we're doing. And we learn a lot in that process. But I also open it up. I mean, it's sort of this perpetual question of what's the best form to share this data in so that it's accessible. And I feel like that's an ongoing open question that we look to groups like this to help us answer. And we are an open book, and we want this data to be usable out there.
Awesome, very exciting.
Yeah, I will point out again, I'm always hesitant to hold what we're doing up as a model for commercial landowners. I mean, it may be relevant for some non-commercial landowners, but we have certain advantages in terms of different missions. Our willingness to pay a much higher tax to the earth, as I call, every tree that dies and falls over and turns into deadwood, I call that tax to the earth, and we're willing to pay a much higher tax. We also have the advantage of having had our land paid for through public, land conservation programs like Forest Legacy, Land for Maine's Future, philanthropic donations. So, a strict application of what we're doing would probably not fly with, the Irving or Weyerhaeuser. But I think the work that Neff is doing and Alec Giffen in terms of trying to increase carbon storage on commercial lands has some we're sort of at one end of the scale. Irving is at the other end of the scale, and Neff is trying to find that sweet spot in the middle using carbon credit income as a way to help compensate for sort of the reduced harvest levels.
Yeah, definitely.
Plus our stream work is that, a lot of our stream work and pre-commercial work is partially funded by Natural Resources Conservation Service, which is eligible to non-commercial private landowners, but not the commercial landowners.
Yeah, thank you for that. We have just a few minutes, and I know that Meg has a couple of follow-up announcements, but I wonder if we can do maybe a quick go back so Carolyn can have a chance to comment. I don't know, Carolyn, if you saw the earlier comments about stocking levels, et cetera, in the chat, and if you wanted to, add your own perspective, because it was a question on one of your slides, I believe.
Let me see. I think that was something that Dave and Steve were talking about. I think they handled that pretty well. It's just, I can't remember going back. Yeah, and Steve made a good point that that some of these lands that we're purchasing and that we've acquired were very low. The stocking was quite low. Like the Roach's contract was at 9 quarts the acre, and I know that we did not harvest on that property for quite a period of years into the ownership. So looking forward, we're trying to regrow the stocking on our property, and the annual allowable harvest that we might have may change depending on our what's actually on the ground and what our management goals kind of as they change as well. So
awesome, thank you. So I hear that you're leaving yourself options, which is great.
Yeah.
We have just a couple minutes left. Meg, I don't know if you wanted to jump in with any last minute announcements or questions. Hopefully folks saw in the chat that registration closes at 1:15 p.m. So this is your chance to join. Meg?
Yes, we've still got a few slots. We will be carpooling up, if by choice, from Orono, from the IGA parking lot, or meeting at the Katahdin Iron Works historical site gate at about 9 on Friday, and will be a full day. And if folks are looking for their SAF CFEs, we have got 5 designated for that. So if you can join us, jump on the link in the chat, please.
Awesome, thank you. Well, we have under a minute to go before my clock turns over. For everyone on the webinar, please join me in a huge virtual round of applause for our panelists. And I hope you all get to come on Friday's field tour. It's going to be great. We're getting several emojis and applauses. So it'll be more fun in person on Friday. But for now, thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Dave. Thank you, Carolyn, for all your work in preparing today's webinar and Friday's field tour. Thank you, Aaron and Meg, for all your behind the scenes stuff in helping make this happen and host this through the University of Maine. We're really excited for Friday. Be well. If you have questions for any of our speakers or for FCCI, then just please reach out. Thank you, everyone.